This podcast is brought to you by the following sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. If you have a long commute or are just too busy to sit down and read, you can still enjoy a good book with Audible.com. There are over 180,000 audiobooks to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 player. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service, and the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. Another great new sponsor is ThinkGeek, the premier retailer for the global geek community. Express your love of Legend of Zelda, Star Wars, Dungeons & Dragons, Skyrim, and more with clever t-shirts and other unique apparel, home and office decor, electronics, collectibles, and so much more. ThinkGeek has great gifts whether you're into science or science fiction, and many of the items you won't find anywhere else. Just follow our link, bit.ly/morbidgeek, to search their massive collection of geeky gear. That's bit.ly/morbidgeek to get your geek on. Now, on with the episode. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. This interest in disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to discuss a famous allegation of murder. The mystery and brutal nature of this story has fascinated me for a long time, which is why I chose it for the first episode of the podcast. Without further ado, let's begin. The day was hot in the small town of Fall River, Massachusetts. It was August the 4th, 1892, and the social climate was on a downhill slope. The streets were full of horses, and the river full of raw sewage. In the 100-degree weather, the stink must have choked the inhabitants. Business was no longer booming, and financial tensions were running high. In February of that year, James McDougall was shot 5 times by his son during an argument over money. Weavers in some of the textile mills that served as the main industry of the town were not allowed to speak during their shifts, possibly to prevent the formation of unions. Not only money was short, the local police were enforcing strict regulations on the sale of alcohol, making it hard for people to drink their sorrows away. Without alcohol, people turned to other more violent forms of entertainment. Rat baiting was on the rise, a blood sport which involved putting terriers into pits with rats and seeing how fast the dog killed them. Cockfights to the death were also growing in popularity. This was the environment in which our story takes place. That August morning, at around 9:30 a.m., Bridget Sullivan, a maid, was cleaning the windows of her employer's home on 92 2nd Street. She had not been feeling well since breakfast. None of the family was well, in fact, possibly due to a meal of mutton that had gone off, but was consumed anyway to avoid the purchase of more meat. While she washed the windows, Bridget could see her employer's 32-year-old daughter, Lizzie, sitting out on the porch in the shade as she toted water back and forth to wash the windows. Completing her work outside, Bridget moved indoors to clean the windows from the inside. The work had been requested by her employer's wife, Abby, that morning at breakfast. After a few moments of work, Lizzie appeared. She told Bridget that Abby had received a note from a sick friend and had left the house to visit them. She also mentioned excitedly that there was a dress sale happening in town. Bridget was interested, and Lizzie encouraged her to go. Bridget, however, was not yet finished with the windows. Smiling vaguely, Lizzie left Bridget to her work. Some time later, there was a knock on the door. Andrew Jackson Borden, Bridget's employer and Lizzie's father, had returned from his business in town. Bridget unlocked the door to let him into the house. Mr. Borden required all doors to be locked inside and out at all times. As she opened the door, Bridget heard a laugh from upstairs. Moments later, Lizzie appeared and greeted her father. She told him about the note, and Abby going to visit her friend. Mr. Borden, also feeling unwell after days of bad mutton and a stressful morning at the bank, retired to the lounge for a nap on the sofa. Her window washing done, Bridget left for her own room in the attic to do the same. Some time later, Bridget awoke to the sound of screams. Lizzie was calling to her from the lounge. When Bridget entered the room, the sight horrified her. Blood was pouring out of 10 deep gashes on Mr. Borden's face. The floor beneath where he lay was soaked with it. Red was spattered across the walls, the sofa he lay on, the painting above it, and all across the ceiling. A detail that stuck with Bridget, and many who viewed the scene after her, was the fact that one of his eyes had been struck cleanly in two. Lizzie calmly sent Bridget for the family physician, Dr. Bowen, who lived across the street. Bridget pounded on the door, but there was no response. Not knowing what else to do, she returned home. Lizzie then sent her for a neighbor and close family friend, Alice Russell, who in turn sent for the police. By the time the police arrived, a crowd had formed outside the house. When asked by the police where her mother was, Lizzie replied that Abby was her stepmother. She told them that her real mother had died when she was a child. This calm correction sparked suspicion in the officer with whom she spoke, but he did not act on it. Lizzie then described the note from Abby's sick friend, but mentioned that the last time she had seen her stepmother was in the guest bedroom, changing the sheets after John Morse, Lizzie's real mother's brother, had left the house with Mr. Borden that morning. Together, Alice and Bridget went upstairs. From the landing, a second horrible sight met their eyes. Abby Borden was face down on the floor of the guest bedroom, the back of her head completely caved in. The pillow sham in her hand, her clothes, the walls, and the chair next to her were spattered in blood. Her long braid, hacked off in the violence of the attack, lay beside her. Over the next few days, the police and close family friends went in and out of the house, collecting evidence and asking questions. Lizzie's older sister Emma returned from Fairhaven, where she had been visiting friends, to find her home in mourning. Protective of her younger sister and desperate for answers, she proposed a $5,000 reward for anyone with information about the murders. No one came forward. The police searched the house, but haphazardly so. Forensics, still a new science at the time, was applied to the scene of the murders. It was determined that the weapon used against Mr. Borden was likely a hatchet. It was also proposed, due to the pattern of the blood on the walls, that the weapon had broken during the carnage, the hatchet head separating from its handle. A hatchet missing its handle was found in the basement, but it was not collected until a few days later. During the trial that followed, one officer said the handle was found next to the hatchet head. Another said the handle was never found. It was, however, noted that ash had been scattered over it, as if an attempt to resemble dust. Lizzie and Emma's rooms were inspected, but not thoroughly. A dress, supposedly the one that Lizzie had worn that day, was collected. There was some question later as to if this really was the dress she had worn, but Lizzie insisted that day that it was. Throughout the entire investigation, Lizzie remained calm and detached. It soon came to light that she was the only person in the house when Abby was murdered. There was a small time frame between breakfast and the time Lizzie had been seen on the porch by Bridget. The note she had mentioned was nowhere to be found, and no friends claimed to have sent such a note to Abby. On top of this, Lizzie seemed unaffected by the brutal nature of the murders, and held that she had never got on well with her stepmother. It was a well-known fact in Fall River that Andrew Borden was not well liked. At the time of his death, his net worth was around $10 million in today's money. Despite this wealth, he was frugal to a fault. While the town and the rest of the state was suffering an economic downturn, he was blossoming, becoming the head of one of the town's largest banks. He also owned a fair amount of property, renting apartments to the people who worked in his textile mills. He was so miserly that when he gave his workers a wage increase, he also increased their rent. In this way, Mr. Borden made many enemies, and some residents of Fall River believed Abby and Andrew were killed for this reason. But Andrew Borden's miserliness extended to his own family. He refused to pay for indoor plumbing in his own house, and instead of living in the wealthy part of town, an area he could definitely afford, he chose to live near his textile factory, in a house that had been cheaply converted from a duplex to a single-family home, which was kept locked at all times, due to his fear of robbery. Lizzie and Emma had been constantly restricted in their purchasing. They had been heard on many occasions to complain about this lack of expenditure. Because of her cold and erratic behavior after the murders, and the fact that she and her sister would benefit financially from the death of their father, police suspicion turned toward Lizzie. Even though they had no murder weapon and no blood had been found on Lizzie's clothes, the police believed that she was the murderer. When Alice came forward, saying that she had seen Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen just days after the murder, it seemed their suspicions had been proven true. On August 8th, an inquest was held in which Lizzie Borden was brought to testify without her attorney. She was unable to keep her story straight, at one time saying she had been ironing during the time of her father's murder, and another time saying she'd been in the barn searching for lead sinkers for a fishing trip she had planned. When questioned about the burning of her dress, she claimed it had been stained with paint, and she was only disposing of it. She was also adamant that she and her stepmother never got along, and that both she and her sister referred to her as Mrs. Borden instead of Mother. On August 11th, Lizzie Borden was arrested and jailed. At first, the town of Fall River supported Lizzie, saying a well-bred woman who taught Sunday school and associated with others of high society could never commit such ghastly murders. At the time, women were considered the weaker sex, incapable of even conceiving of such an act. But as the details of Lizzie's lack of feeling about the murders and her cold demeanor toward her mother came out, gossip began to circulate. It came to light that Lizzie had been accused of shoplifting on more than one occasion. A pharmacist said that the day before the murder she had come to him for prussic acid, what we know today as cyanide, with the pretense of cleaning something with it. Though he had not sold it to her, her attempt did nothing to quell the police suspicions. Evidence of tension in the Borden house began to mount as the police tried to put together a case substantial enough for trial by grand jury. Dr. Bowen reported that Abby had come to him the day before the murder, ranting that she thought the family was being poisoned by one of her husband's enemies. The milk within the house was tested, but no poison was found. When questioned about Lizzie's relationship with her stepmother, Bridget told police that at first the two women were cordial, but that neither Emma nor Lizzie tended to eat their meals with their parents. It was also revealed that a few months before the murder, Abby had wanted to make a pigeon pie. Mr. Borden obligingly killed a flock of pigeons that he kept in the family barn. Lizzie, however, had considered these birds as her pets and was extremely upset. A family argument in June prompted both sisters to take extended vacations away from their parents. A week before the murders, Lizzie returned early, but even then she chose to stay in a rooming house for the first 4 days of her return, rather than go home. Something was making her hesitate to return. Lizzie's trial in front of a grand jury took place on June 5, 1893, more than a year after the murders had taken place. Lizzie had remained in jail, treated as guilty before her trial had even begun. It was because of this malpractice of the law that the judge threw out the testimony she had given at the inquest. His reasoning was the testimony had been given under duress and without an attorney. The pharmacist's testimony about the prussic acid was also thrown out. It was judged to be too remote in the time frame to have any connection to the murders. Without her erratic behavior as evidence, The only evidence against her was a witness account of Lizzie burning a dress. Bridget Sullivan was brought in to testify at the trial. According to her statement, Bridget went upstairs around 10:58 a.m., leaving Lizzie and her father downstairs. Lizzie said she then went into the barn and was not in the house for about a half an hour. A neighbor testified that he indeed saw Lizzie leaving the barn at 11:03 a.m. Another confirmed that time. Lizzie had called to Bridget at 11:10, leaving only 7 minutes in which she could have murdered her father and cleaned herself and the murder weapon of blood. As I mentioned before, because of the illness that had struck the Borden household just before the murders, the milk from the family's kitchen was tested for poison. The contents of Andrew and Abby Borden's stomachs, which was removed during the autopsies performed in the Borden's dining room, were also tested. No poison was found. Both Mr. and Mrs. Borden's heads were also removed during the autopsy, and the skulls were used as evidence during trial. When the battered skulls of her parents were revealed, Lizzie fainted, earning her the pity of the jury. The heads were later buried at the foot of Mr. and Mrs. Borden's graves. Near the end of the trial, the only evidence that Lizzie Borden had murdered her father and stepmother was her presence in the house at the time of the murders. On June 20th, after deliberating for only an hour and a half, the jury moved to acquit Lizzie Borden. No one else was ever formally accused. A similar axe murder did occur in Fall River between the time of the Borden murders and the trial. This might have removed suspicion from Lizzie during that time frame, but the perpetrator of the other murder was proven to be out of the country when the Bordens were killed. Did Lizzie Borden escape justice? Did she kill her father and stepmother and get away with it? At first, I thought so. There seemed to be no other logical explanation. She was in the house at the time of the murders. Her account of her whereabouts that day didn't add up. She burned a dress that could have been stained with blood, and she was cold and unfeeling during her trial. These are not the behaviors of an innocent person. If she did kill them, why? Perhaps she was finally so frustrated by being part of the upper class and still unable to live like the rest of them in opulent houses with nice clothing and indoor plumbing that she finally snapped. Trying to be normal or keep up appearances amongst peers is often a cause of stress today. I imagine it was the same in 1892, if not more stressful. Small-town gossip can be brutal, and being an outcast amongst peers is never easy. Other theories as to why Lizzie might have done it involve forbidden love, abuse, and of course, money. Ed McBain, a mystery author, proposed that Lizzie and Bridget may have been caught having a romantic tryst by Mrs. Borden. McBain theorized that perhaps Mrs. Borden's reaction was so negative that Lizzie, in a fugue state, killed her. When her father came home, Lizzie confessed to the murder, and when he grew just as furious, Lizzie killed him too. Bridget then could have disposed of the murder weapon. Another theory speculates that Lizzie was physically and sexually abused by Mr. Borden for years, and the day of the murder was the day she lashed out against him. There is little evidence to support this, but incest is not a topic that was discussed at the time, and methods for collecting physical evidence of abuse were quite different in 1892. As I read the trial transcripts, the conflicting stories, the contaminated crime scene, the utter lack of evidence, doubt grew in my mind. There was no indoor plumbing, so even if Lizzie killed her parents naked, as has been suggested for the reason she had no blood on her, how could she have cleaned herself up in the 7 minutes that passed between her father's murder and her call for Bridget? How could she have also cleaned the axe and planted it in the basement, complete with ashes sprinkled over it to look like dust in those 7 minutes? That would have taken a massive amount of planning. It's true she acted strangely from the time of the murder to her trial, but perhaps there is another explanation for her behavior. She may have been in shock. She was the first person to find the body of her father, and the blood was still wet when she saw him. That scene could bring some people to hysterics, but others react differently, growing numb and despondent instead. Her world had been torn apart. There is no way to predict how someone will act when something like that happens. Also, Mr. Borden may have been strict and frugal, but he loved his daughters and they loved him. Every day he wore a pinky ring given to him by Lizzie at the age of 15. He sold property to his daughters for $1 and bought it back from them for $3,000. He covered up for Lizzie's shoplifting by paying for everything, saving her from scandal. It's true she could have done it, but there is enough doubt to make me and the jury think twice. They did the lawful thing by acquitting Lizzie Borden. She may have done it, but there wasn't enough evidence to prove it. But if Lizzie didn't do it, who did? There are several theories that propose other suspects. William Borden was an apple farmer who lived several miles north of Fall River. He was called a cousin, but was suspected to be Mr. Borden's illegitimate son, though the Bordens denied the rumor. William was considered touched, which at the time meant mentally deficient in some way. He constantly ranted about a rich man and wealth that would one day be his, all while cradling his favorite object, a hatchet. He treated the hatchet and spoke to it like a friend. His life was a hard one. He spent a short time in an insane asylum, but later poisoned and then hung himself in a barn in 1901. His whereabouts were unknown on the day of the murders. If you asked me, I would say there are a lot of suspicious similarities between William and the murders. Perhaps Mr. Borden's generosity to Abby Borden's relatives instead of his own daughters was the last straw for Lizzie's sister, Emma, who, having established an alibi at Fairhaven, Massachusetts, about 15 miles away from Fall River, could have gone secretly to the house to commit the murders and then returned to Fairhaven just in time to receive the telegram informing her of the murders. Or perhaps something about Mr. Borden's business dealings with John Morse, who rarely met with the family after his sister died, but came to stay with them the night before the murders, might have triggered Lizzie or John himself to lash out. Despite all these theories, there isn't enough evidence to say who murdered Mr. and Mrs. Borden. If forensics at the time of the murders had been what they are today, it's very likely this case would have been solved. Because this incident has captivated hundreds since its occurrence, many adaptations of Lizzie's story have been produced in books, television, art, and film. A novelization of the entire incident was written by Elizabeth Engstrom and titled simply Lizzie Borden. This artistic adaptation is based on the theory of abuse and the totalitarian rule of Andrew Borden as the motive for his death by Lizzie's hand. Another adaptation of Lizzie's story is The Secrets of Lizzie Borden by Brandy Purdy. Purdy creates a literary portrait of the woman behind the unthinkable crime by examining the resentment that must have been felt by Lizzie and Emma toward their father for his frugality, despite their wealth. Another novel that explores this theme is Lizzie Borden, the Girl with the Pansy Pin, written by Michael Thomas Brimbaugh. There is even a series of short stories that imagine Lizzie Borden as a girl detective, written by Richard Behrens. A showcase of a collection of fine art inspired by the legend of Lizzie Borden took place in September 2015 and was held by the Fall River Arts Community and the staff of Mom and Pop Tattoo and Piercing Incorporated. The images produced for this exhibition range from historically referenced facts to widely speculated motivations. In television and film, there are too many adaptations to count, but several of my favorites include The Legend of Lizzie Borden, a 1975 film starring Elizabeth Montgomery, Lizzie Borden's Revenge, starring Jenny Alford, in which the spirit of Lizzie Borden is summoned by a group of girls at a slumber party. I love bad horror films. And Lizzie Borden Took an Axe and The Lizzie Borden Chronicles, which both feature Christina Ricci as a psychotic Lizzie Borden. In 2015, it was announced that Kristen Stewart and Chloe Sevigny will star in another film about Lizzie Borden. There is also a death metal band who took that suspected murderess's name as their own. Even dance moms got in on the action when Maddie, the young dancer famously known for her collaborations with singer Sia, performed a dance at the New York Dance Experience based on Lizzie Borden, in which she wielded an axe during her modern dance performance. The Borden house is still standing. It was converted into a combination bed and breakfast and museum. For a fee, you can tour the house and even stay the night in the very rooms in which the grisly murders took place. Digital night vision cameras have been set up throughout the house in order to catch possible ghost activity. The video from these cameras is live streamed on the Borden House website, lizzie-borden.com, and you can tune in whenever you want with a yearly subscription to the feed. The Lizzie Borden house is said to be one of the most haunted buildings in America. There are regular reports of paranormal experiences by guests and staff, including disembodied footsteps and voices, cold spots, objects moving on their own, physical manifestations like touching, being pushed, or being pulled, and full-body apparitions. Most believe the spirits are those of Andrew and Abby Borden, wandering the house seeking their murderer. Others say it's Lizzie herself. It is also believed that not only the Bordens haunt the house. The third floor is rumored to be haunted by the spirits of 2 children. In 1848, in the house next door to the Borden home, another family was the victim of a double murder. A mother drowned her 2 young children in a cistern in the basement, which was actually on the Borden's property. Another spirit said to haunt the 3rd floor of the Borden house is that of a caretaker named Michael, who worked for the owners of the house after the Bordens left. He died in a fire in Connecticut, and it is said his spirit still remains in the chimney room at the top of the house. Several teams of paranormal investigators have investigated the house. The Transatlantic Paranormal Society, better known as TAPS, did an episode of their TV show Ghost Hunters on the Borden house. The show holds that TAPS's first mission is to try to debunk hauntings. That way, any evidence left that can't be debunked is more likely to be proof of a haunting. Their investigation took place when the house was being renovated, an event that is said to bring out ghost activity. The instruments used for their investigation included temperature sensors, digital voice recorders, night vision cameras, and electromagnetic field detectors. If you're new to ghost hunting, these devices are all considered to be the standard instruments of paranormal investigation. A loud bang was heard on the 3rd floor during TAPS's overnight investigation, but it turned out to be an air conditioner turning on and off. The team concluded that most of the occurrences that have been reported are ambiguous and not necessarily related to the murders that took place in the house, but they would be open to further investigations in the future. In an episode of Monster Quest, another team of investigators used similar equipment to TAPS to try and catch ghostly activity in key areas such as the bedrooms, the basement, and the 3rd floor, but added to their investigative devices was an infrared camera. The final analysis of the video evidence collected during the investigation revealed nothing out of the ordinary until the review of the footage from the infrared camera. The bottom of a toy chest in the chimney room appeared hot to the touch, and a cold spot was visible in Bridget's attic room. The audio recorders also seemed to have caught voices. One of these was determined to be audio white noise when analyzed by a voice recognition expert, but a sound picked up in Lizzie's own bedroom did appear to be a male human voice. The narrator of the episode stated that it may not be proof beyond a doubt, but that something strange is still going on at the Borden house. Smaller groups and individuals have also investigated the house. Many of these investigations can be found on YouTube if you're interested. Just search Lizzie Borden and Paranormal. One group, Lawson Paranormal, are on their 4th visit to the house, believing to have made contact with Lizzie herself during their last visit. We are all captivated by Lizzie Borden. The murders of her father Andrew and stepmother Abby Borden to this day remain a gruesome mystery that may never be solved, and that is why it brings out the curiosity in us. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by HMS Lloyd. If you want to get in touch and share your views on whether Lizzie killed her parents or not, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or join us on Facebook at facebook.com/Morbid Curiosity Podcast. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thank you for listening.